joined here with Mark Cabrinha. He has been a professor of architecture in Cal Poly, now sitting as the associate dean, correct?
Correct.
And he's here to talk a little bit about his journey through his career. I'll let him give a little background on what he's done architecturally, but we all know now that he's at Cal Poly, this will be talking about what that looks like, being an architect within academia. What does that really mean? What does that career path entail? And so it's going to be exciting. So Mark, why don't we start with just a little bit about yourself? Like, where did you come from? What did you do after graduating from university, undergrad?
Well, first, Andrew, thank you. I think this is really great. We often are so busy being professors, we don't often have the opportunity to just tell our life story, to kind of share our path, and also kind of being kind of very human with students, which I think is great. I think most students know I'm a Cal Poly grad. I graduated in 1995. I was actually in school during there was a recession in the early 90s. So when I graduated, I was coming out of a recession. And so things were still a little bit slow. Long story short, but as a student at Cal Poly, I did 3 big cross-country road trips with 2 of my friends. A friend had a Honda, and we just put a bunch of ragu spaghetti in a tent and just went, and we just toured all kinds of different buildings. And anyhow, the visit to Chicago for me was amazing, and I just fell in love with that city. I, like many students, was a suburban kid growing up. San Francisco is the big scary city, and so I was not an urban guy, and I just fell in love with Chicago. When I graduated from Cal Poly, I was really interested in moving to Chicago, and it just so happened that my girlfriend, then fiance, went to Northwestern for grad school. So that was just like, let's go. And so the rest is history there. We thought we'd be in Chicago for maybe 2 or 3 years, and she has a lot of family in New York City, and so we thought maybe we'd kind of keep moving into New York City. But long story short, again, not so short, is we were in Chicago for 7 years. Absolutely loved living in that city. We had an amazing time there. I worked first in a small practice of about 9 people. In the summer, we would bring on a lot of interns, and I never talk about that job too much. I mean, that's actually really where I feel like I cut my teeth in a super small practice. We did churches and parochial schools, and that was my introduction into school design. And what I loved about that practice is the 2 partners also taught at the university, and so that was already an introduction and kind of seeing how one might run a practice and also teach, how that really brought in the kinds of people that worked for them and kind of what their attitudes and aspirations were in terms of a staff. But it also, I think, maybe intentionally or just as a matter of necessity, meant that I was right out of school and had a ton of freedom. You know, it was crazy. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, and you know, designing pretty big. I mean, big relative to a small practice like that, but the thing I remember the most, my most significant learning experience there, and there were definitely project architects that were mentoring me, and one is still a very dear friend. But this was you know, the internet was not really what it was then as it is now. And so I was designing this whole building through a fax machine, constantly sketching details, and then faxing it to a stone fabricator and saying, you mean like this? You mean like this? And it was great. And the big lesson learned was that fabricator was so happy that I was doing this in the design phase and not in the construction phase.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? And it was a totally different conversation. And so I learned a lot. I learned a lot how to put a building together, a set of drawings together. And also that practice, interestingly enough, right, in the mid-90s, we were still at that cusp between, are we hand drawing, are we digital drawing? You know, we talk about the way we're doing this Revit transition now, which is really slow. It was the AutoCAD transition then. And this was in many ways, for a practice its size, was really cutting edge. We had our own technology officer, and I think it had to do with their academic ties as well, is that we were really ahead of the curve of developing incredibly strong standards, using 3D modeling as part of our design process. It sounds antiquated now, but at the time it was kind of a big deal. So that actually then, that experience, I think I was only there for 2 years, and I was looking for a little bit more, and I had an opportunity in a really large firm in Chicago called OWP&P. It was really a regional firm, incredibly well known for healthcare, corporate interiors, and then education. And the way that firm was designed was by project type. So there was like an interiors group, a corporate group, a healthcare group, education group. So I was hired in the education group. Well, that's not true. I wanted to be in the education group. The opening they had for me was in housing. And so I did some really, learned a lot in multifamily housing, mixed use, as well as high-rise housing. And oh gosh, stories, they're so fun. You know, when you work in a city like Chicago with a massive firm like that, there are so many characters. And, you know, I think academia still kind of poo-poos big firms, and I'm happy I had both experiences. But one of the things I got from the big firm was experts, and really being able to, you know, John Maxey was this incredibly known Chicago high-rise housing expert, and he was a character, had quite a mouth, and coffee meant espresso. So I started drinking espresso regularly at that time. Yep. And then I did a lot in K through 12, and that's really the work that I'm most proud of, and an incredible group of innovative school design. You know, and it's funny that I just described the first 7 years. Actually, that was the 6 years out of school. So, but you know, that's a side of me that I often don't talk about. During that time, the 7 years in Chicago, I also went to grad school. And so,
yeah, I was going to ask, was that because of your first career choice, that first office, seeing the education there?
You know, so in terms of alternate career paths, I was thinking about that, and it was actually my ARC 251 faculty, Donna Dirk. I was just a little bird, and we remember having this sort of chat in studio, and she said, "So are any of you ever interested in teaching?" And I just remember thinking, and I was shy, I didn't really raise my hand or anything like that. I just kind of said, I hadn't thought about teaching. I think I would love that. And so it's amazing to me that very early in my architectural education, she planted that thought, and that thought kind of stuck with me. So I'll come back to that, because the story is long and there's so many things to share, but you know, the full thing may not be as interesting. But I did my master's in University of Illinois at Chicago, and it was really quick. It was a 1-year master's because I had the 5-year BArch, and you know, I'll get back to it, but many reasons I think that was phenomenal for me. And what I learned in the master's is I intentionally really wanted that to be about me and my development, and as focusing on design, not on professional practice. But while I was doing my master's, I was also doing construction administration on a project I had just spent about, I guess at that point it was like 12 months in, for a really wonderful school as a project architect. And so it was really wonderful to be doing about 10 to 15 hours a week, doing, you know, change orders and RFIs, requests for information, and, you know, supplemental drawings and all of that, while I'm learning Maya and animation and digital fabrication without digital fabrication. And so it was really pretty fantastic.
Nice.
Wow. And, you know, so that's maybe kind of cutting then to how I started teaching. I mean, the whole, my interest in doing the master's was I really wanted to teach. And what teaching to me, the model I had was this model of balancing practice and teaching, this sort of dream perfect scenario.
Right.
What I began to learn both the way I did my master's while I was also working, but really as I was mentored by Doug Garofalo, who was my faculty professor at University of Illinois. Doug was a true pioneer in digital design and digital fabrication. And just, he's actually was an amazing, caring guy. I mean, it was, as you got to know him, you're like, wow, he really cares. But also, he's kind of a badass. And so it was pretty neat. But what, a couple of times I went to his house and just kind of chatted with him about, my ambitions. And he really laid bare that, there is no such thing as 50% practice and 50% teaching. He was basically like, no, it's more like 90% practice and 90% teaching. And you could just kind of see even the way, he chose to live his life, which was amazing. But I kind of began to realize like, wow, that's going to be rough, especially, if I want to be a dad. So that was a main part of that. And so lo and behold, the dad part, my daughter was born in Chicago. The week before she was born, I got a job offer to be a tenure track professor at Washington State in Pullman. Okay. The week after she was born, I got an offer from Cal Poly to be a lecturer for 1 year. So it's a pretty interesting, like, how do you make that decision, right? And you go to Washington.
We know that you came to Cal Poly.
Exactly.
So
well,
what happened there?
I actually really enjoyed the faculty at Washington State. I thought the school curriculum was really interesting. I thought I was a little reticent in going. The big question I asked was, so the population in town is 23,000. Does that include the 19,000 students?
Yeah.
You think Cal Poly is a small town.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is they were hiring me as a kind of digital expert. And I had some real hesitance in just the way they understood the digital transition, in that you would hire a single faculty that was the digital expert, and they wanted me to teach the faculty. And I was just like, whoa, I just spent, 7 years of my life really skilling up because I thought it was important. It's not like I had this in my education. Right. I would be at work all day, you learn at work, but then I'd go home at night and be like, all right, if I want to push design ahead through these tools, I got to learn more. Yep. And so I think, that doesn't change today. I think that's always that case, but it's not what we don't talk about that. It's not like architecture stopped at 5 o'clock. Maybe it stopped at 7 and I went home, but then at 9 o'clock, I'm back on and, working on something architecture related, but for myself.
Right.
So anyway, I chose Cal Poly, even though at great risk. I turned down a tenure track position, which had security, for a job that had zero security. Right. It had a 1-year position and there was a chance that it was renewable for 2 years. And I think I've always kind of been this way, that if I was putting down a bet or valuing the risk proposition, if that risk was based on how I could perform, I would always take that risk, because I felt like I had the control, and it was also a win situation. If I wasn't in that situation and I couldn't perform, then I don't want to be there. Right? So it was really easy to say, I'm going for it. I think I'm going to be good at this. I have no idea if I will. And that's kind of one of the crazy things. And we'll kind of maybe come back to that, as how you, even while you're practicing, you can make little inroads into teaching.
Absolutely.
But when I started at Cal Poly, it was largely blind faith. It was just like, I'm passionate about this. I think I can be good at it, but I really don't know. And so started at Cal Poly, fell in love with teaching. And after 2 years at Cal Poly, kind of realized if I wanted to do this for the rest of my career, I really wanted to do a Ph.D. And that had a little bit to do with the M.Arch was just too quick. It was really 2 semesters. And so the PhD, maybe we can come back to that and kind of how challenging that is.
Yeah, let's come back to that, and we'll talk even process of why that is important
Yeah,
too?
yeah. But long story short is, again, total risk, leaving Cal Poly, pursuing the PhD with the kind of confidence of a logical wager, which was, I'm going to develop this area of expertise that I think is really appropriate for Cal Poly. The way I see things going, I think they're going to be ready for it when I'm ready with the PhD. If they're not, I know a lot of schools are going to be looking for this. So
Right.
it's kind of a win-win. And
So how
it
many
worked
years
out, and
were
here I
you
am.
at Cal Poly though, before you went to, and you went to Rensselaer for your
Yeah,
PhD? How many
yeah,
years did you practice as a lecturer?
2 years, 2 years. Yeah.
2 years, okay. That's interesting. And as you get into that mindset and you're switching over to Cal Poly, and you had said something about your professor saying it was more like 90%, 90.
Yeah.
You left practice behind. You weren't practicing in SLO, were you?
Yeah, I wasn't. And I had thought about it. To be honest, I actually had a sit down with Tom DeSanto, who I was just getting to know. Sorry, this is hilarious thinking back. This is a long time ago for me.
Yeah.
We actually, the first time we met, I was new to Los Osos, and I got to know Tom, and Tom was doing more practice, kind of that balance between teaching. He wasn't tenure track. He was also a lecturer. And I said, Tom, I'd really like to meet with you and kind of see. And so we met at the Merrymaker in Los
Oh my
Osos,
gosh,
right? Like when you look up dive bar and then
Yep.
Wikipedia, you get
Huge
the
dive bar.
Merrymaker.
Love it.
I'm like, who is this guy? I still remember that. That's funny. And then I also met with George, and we kind of, George and I said, I'm thinking about,
Yep.
and that was a forking path. I have to say, that was a decision I don't think I made consciously. I think momentum and inertia kind of went that way. But I was really thinking about, well, maybe I'll practice and be a lecturer. I also thought about starting my own fabrication company in San Luis Obispo through digital fabrication and kind of, it's kind of a romantic dream of just having a big warehouse and a CNC router and,
Right.
doing stuff. There wasn't really a market yet for that. So I was thinking about, well, maybe, projects from San Francisco and LA, we could kind of come up because, if real estate was cheaper here, then I could make it work out. I actually started looking at real estate. Real estate's not cheaper here. So it just didn't work out. But anyway, so I chose to do the PhD.
So in that first couple of years at Cal Poly, and yes, I know based on your resume that you had some teaching. You were teaching a teacher's assistant. You had some teaching experience anyway. But what was it like? Those first couple of years at Cal Poly, and what does that career look like transitioning from practice to teaching? Like, most people that are probably listening to this and watching this are not familiar with what that career looks like. What is that first entry?
Yeah, the first thing I have to say is I feel like I became an architect and a designer when I was practicing. And I began to understand design in a totally different way in practice. And in many ways, it's still how I teach, which is to say that materiality, structure, those are not things that we add on to a design concept. They're actually the language of architecture. And so it was in practice where I begin to understand the language of architecture and how you use that language for expression and articulation and spatial development. And in the early 90s, this was early 90s, there was no work, right? And so even the way we were educated, this was decon and philosophy and theory, and that's a whole other side we'll hopefully get back to because the students will be surprised. Like, I'm a philosophy nerd. I love that.
Right.
But that just wasn't the way that design was taught. And I don't think it's so much about being the way it's taught, but just being that part of being an architect is not just school, it's also practice. And so that part of the practice really helped me a lot. The other thing I still challenge with to this day is in practice, economy is everything, right? There is always the budget. Even Frank Gehry complains about budgets. And yet that is just completely absent from education, which in some ways I think is good. But it also just means that there's a whole other level of decision making, not about the dollar, but I always like to say it's not about money, it's about value. And so it's about why this is the right decision. Even if it's expensive, it could have value, right? It actually is it contributes to the design in such a significant way that you really have to have it.
Right.
Anyway, so I went into practice and teaching, and that really carried forward with me. And actually, I should say it's interesting. I was incredibly confident when I started teaching based on my professional experience, and maybe it has to do with I was still pretty young. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know, how old was I? 23, 24.
Yeah, 2002.
Yeah, and yet to be coming from practice where you're, running $30 million jobs, like the school I did was 13. At the time I was doing a project that was a $30 million job, and it kind of just had a lot of confidence.
Yep.
And so it's kind of amazing that I was able to kind of just take that in and into my teaching. But I think there's a difference between, confidence is a difficult word, because confidence can get confused with arrogance. And I was very confident about some things that I knew, and I was very confident with how much I didn't know, and was very okay with that. In fact, that was the beauty of going into education, is teaching, is the desire to continually learn. Which I think is really, really important. And I think one of the most success, I think about that first studio, I taught a lot. In many ways, I had a year and a half to prepare for that studio, not a couple of weeks. And, and I also think about that studio as an incredible risk. It was a third-year studio. It was 351. It was studio and practice all together. And I just jumped in, and it was an incredible risk. And I had students doing some early conceptual things that it worked, and it could have totally failed. And so anyway, I think maybe enough there.
No, it's really good to understand the trajectory of the career, and then how you felt going into what is basically your alternative career from practice.
Yeah.
So as you started to learn what this was about, you had said, now is the time to further educate myself, prepare myself for coming back to teaching. You then decided to go back across the country again.
Yeah.
To New York, and you're going to RPI. And what is that decision about? Like, why go in and get a PhD to become a professor?
Oh man, that is
a tact that you have to take in some aspects to advance. And
yeah,
about that. But why?
Yeah, the thing I didn't share, that first studio teaching, I remember coming home. So my daughter was born in Chicago when I started teaching, right? So now she's 4-6 months old. We'd come home, we'd go on a quick walk. And then I just remember every night telling my wife, okay, you need to leave me alone. I need to focus on what I'm teaching tomorrow. It was a gauntlet, because there was so much for me to learn, but I also recognized there was so much I knew that I could give, and I wanted to give it all. Yeah. And I didn't know how to pace myself. Right. So it was just, constant. And I just remember going, oh my God, I can't do this forever. So in that 2 years of teaching, 9 quarters at Cal Poly, I think I taught 13 unique classes.
Wow. And
what I realized was, without a real clear career trajectory, without, a little bit more of a, you're filling in the gaps. And I was just moved all over the place. That was a great experience as a teacher. As a human being, it was rough. Yeah. So I knew from my master's, I've always been very interested in the digital physical transition and translation. And that has to do with growing up in Cupertino in the Bay Area when Apple was starting. that has very much to do with being a 7th grader and taking a visual programming class called Logo, right? Which was like amazing. And I still think about that, and I can even come back to that. And so I got a taste of it in Masters of Architecture in Chicago. And I saw Doug Garofalo doing it, but we didn't really have the tools and the access that we had today, right? Like Harvard had a CNC router at that time, and it cost several $100,000. It was a little bit like CNC routers then were like kind of what robots are now.
Right.
So long story short, one other very important thing. I was still, because I came from practice, was trying to integrate digital into my studio teaching. I was the devil. Oh my God. I got so much grief from faculty at that time that they were like, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. I'm just like, wait, I'm confused. Have you been in an office lately? And it was amazing. And so I just thought, no, I could spend my career fighting and resisting. And I mean no disrespect to so many wonderful people. I just said, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave and become an expert in this. When I come back, some of them will have retired. And I really cared about them. They're just like, this wasn't part of their background. And I think also Cal Poly would be in a place where they're ready for this. And my mission has always been about bringing the kind of shop tradition of the school into the 21st century. Doesn't mean you leave the 20th and the 19th behind. It just means like, let's keep going. And so the decision to go to RPI was multiple. And I was choosing between Harvard and RPI. And Harvard was going to be a Doctor of Design. And so I liked the idea that it was design focused. Harvard was also going to cost me something like $130,000 in student debt. RPI, I totally connected with Bill Massey, who was one of the early pioneers in digital fabrication. He was at Columbia and when it was all digital, and he bought himself a little 4x4 CNC router, was making models for Billy Shin and doing all kinds of stuff. And you know, there's a whole other tangent there, but he found his way back to RPI, and we just started talking, and just like I said, oh my God. Somebody told me a very important thing is when you're looking at your kind of advanced degree like that, it's not just where you're going, it's who you want to study with.
Yep.
I think it's really, really important because the brand, let's be real, like the brand is a brand.
Right.
Harvard has an amazing brand, and that's going to continually draw people to it. But when I looked inside the brand and like how I would fit in there, it was like, I'm a profit center for you. I'm not, you know, and that's how their Doctor of Design is. When I went to RPI, it was a brand new Ph.D. program. There had been no other students. I was the first one there in this Ph.D. in architectural science. And I totally resonated with Bill. Bill was living my dream. Bill was teaching. He had a warehouse. He was doing, you know, massive full-scale digital fabrication. You go into this warehouse and it's just like full-scale mock-ups. And Bill had a thing with cardboard and stacking, like doing all of this stuff. And, you know, and it was just like, it was interesting. But so I just like, I went for it. With the other two important things is they offered me a fellowship, which meant I was going to RPI at no expense. So my tuition was completely paid. I was on a fellowship the first year, and then the promise of being a teaching fellow following years. And that gave me a stipend that would cover, I guess it covered housing costs and a little bit of living expenses. I didn't know at the time when I accepted that the healthcare fees were going to take most of that, but I think students are familiar with how that goes.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that was really important to me. I didn't want to take on massive debt to do this, and I also knew I was going to be so completely absorbed in my studies. It was very important to me that my wife Idona and had support around her, and her family is New York City. So RPI was about 2.5 hours from New York City, and that ended up being a really significant decision, so that she had support around her, and our son was born there during my studies. And so PhD.
So what is it? Let's talk about the PhD, because you're saying it is 100% for you. This was for you.
Yeah.
It's yourself. But the other side of this coin is advancement of your career.
Yeah.
That PhD provides for you. What door does that unlock? What happens?
You know, what's interesting is, and this is just how PhDs go, and it doesn't matter if you're in biology, architecture, chemistry, physics. Every PhD I've talked to, there is a moment of getting broken down. You go into the PhD, you think you know what you're doing. I still had my confidence from practice, 2 years of successful teaching, and I thought to myself, I know what I'm doing. I can get this done in 3 years. No way. Oh my God. And so the first year, you know, I came in and I was just like, I was a fellow, I was doing my own. It was great. It was an amazing year. It was a really amazing year. And I thought I knew what I was doing, and I just got hammered. And, you know, they were trying to figure out what they thought their PhD program should be. Frankly, I was trying to get done and get out. And, you know, that's really unfortunate, because you kind of start thinking about, whoa, chill out, like take the time, absorb it, just fully take advantage of everything that's in front of you, even though it's not what you expected it to be. But, you know, you're married, you're not making any money. You have a kid. You're like, what am I doing? And so there were many moments of that. What am I doing? And I think it's actually a good experience. It's not an experience that I would encourage or want to go back to. But what that means is, at a certain point, it is for yourself, but there is also a belief behind it that what you are doing is really important for how you're going to teach in the future, for your research. And that's also a really driving factor. When you're doing a PhD, you're really supposed to be doing original work that advances your profession, or your subject area. And so that was, you know, that also is a driving force.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that was a pretty tough time. Yeah, but also
envy
kind of romantic one.
Yeah. So what happens after your PhD? Where did you go from RPI?
So yeah, so the interesting thing is the PhD didn't end when I kind of kept teaching, and that was kind of fundamental to my PhD, was the impact of technology on design culture through the lens of digital fabrication. So it was never about the tools. It certainly was driven to learn the tools and kind of, you know, develop technique and all of that, but it was really trying to understand. It was completely about my 2 years at Cal Poly thinking, what the hell just happened? Like, what's the resistance with the computer? Like, what is going on here? We're having the wrong conversation. And I think it was, that was fundamentally, I think, what I was trying to say is this isn't about hand drawing. This isn't about drawing with a mouse. This is really about the identity of the architect and how we position ourselves relative to conceptualization and actualization, right? That we have to think through this spectrum between design and how we execute designs, right? Because for me, architecture is always about the built thing, and the built thing is not about an object, but it's about people. And that for me came from professional practice. Like, once you spend years of your life designing, you see your way through construction, and then you see people, you know, move in this case, a school, and that school use, and I was able to like present the design to the students in the school, watching teachers use that space. That fundamentally changes you. And I didn't even, you know, that's when you become an architect, is it's not about just the design and the construction and all the technique and technicality. It's about people. And that was really wonderful. So that's a little tangent, but a really important one, because I'm just blown away with how much in design school and architecture school, we don't talk about the fact that this is about people. And of course, well, let's not go there. I did my coursework at RPI. During that time, the saving grace for me was learning science and technology studies, which is a blend between sociology, philosophy, and cultural anthropology. And those early pioneers in that subject were looking, using the lens of cultural anthropology to actually study how technology was being implemented natively, let's say, like in the United States. So instead of cultural anthropology being about Bali, let's now actually take those skills of observation and apply that to how technology is being developed. And the famous example was at Xerox PARC at the very development of the computer and trying to understand who the computer was for and all of this. So I was able to take a lot of that, and that really grounded and positioned how I understood what my research was. But from that, gave me my research methodology. And that was then about, one was the indigenous ethnographer, which was kind of being from within your own kind of cultural tribe, but also being on the outside looking in, right? So who was I? I was a licensed architect. I had taught, but was not a professor. And yet I was fundamentally studying the impact of design, technology, and practice. So it was a really interesting way of being on the inside and the outside at the same time. And then the big idea, and I think the most significant thing, was then the studio ethnography, which was being an observer as a professor about how its students thought this was all about. And so what was important, and what I didn't know until you start teaching at different schools, is architecture is taught very similarly wherever you go. But the culture of the school is totally different. So Cal Poly was very much hands-on physical modeling, and I love that it still is. I went to RPI, and at that time I was like, oh my God, you have a laptop requirement? Like, this is amazing. You know, it's an engineering technology school. Their central building for technology and computer support, I kid you not, was a converted church. So my first visit there was like, wow, interesting.
See what you put up there, high.
Really interesting. Anyway, and then so the opportunity through a network I started developing in this was to go and teach at University of Oregon. They were looking for somebody to help do some of their first year digital skills work. And I said, you know, I can do that and I'll be pretty good at it. It won't really advance me. I will teach that if you'll allow me to do a research studio that's part of my PhD thesis work. And that became amazing. So I was only there for 2 quarters. It was an adventure, but it really helped. That was the opportunity that allowed me to have my whole PhD fall into place, with the good faith that I'm going to do it at Eugene. I think maybe I could have an opportunity and do that at Cal Poly, and then I would do one at RPI. And so I would have 3 different school cultures: a culture that was very much about sort of sustainability and University of Oregon. Cal Poly was very much sort of physical modeling, hand drawing, and then RPI was like Columbia Light. I mean, it was just digital, 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 digital. It's like, we don't make shit here. We just render well, I shouldn't be saying these things. Great school. Really was. But I was just blown away with how much it was about the render and not about other conversations. But
that's great.
Whew.
So, yeah. So you went to Oregon. You got your PhD, or in the process of PhD, but you come back to Cal Poly.
Yeah.
what's the experience between those first 2 years and then now coming back as someone more advanced?
Okay, so so just to be clear, when I came back to Cal Poly, I didn't have my PhD done, and so
but it was in process.
But it was in process. You know, all I had to do was the writing, which and we can kind of talk about that. But that was actually a brilliant structure to develop as an early tenure track professor. Is all of my writing for my PhD was actually the opportunity to present at peer-reviewed conferences along the way. So my tenure track resume was really fantastic for, you know, kind of what became chapters in my PhD were first tested out as presentations and research papers. And so that's, I think for architects, that was a great way to do it. I did it by necessity. I just now in hindsight was like, that's fantastic. So what was Cal Poly like? You know, the really interesting thing was, even though I had left Cal Poly, I really never did. Every summer I came back to teach the architecture summer career workshop. That was a really important source of income for me during that time to survive. I think emotionally it also helped me survive because it kept that that connection to the West Coast and this idea about staying connected to Cal Poly. And so during that time, I would actually, there were new faculty like Robert Ahrens, somebody else that students don't know now, Jim Dorfler, and really kind of still met with them. And so all along the way while I was gone, we were still kind of like, hey, what kind of tools do we need? Is this the right tool? Is this not the right tool? And so I was kind of, I was not shepherding it. I do not want to pretend that was the case. That was really not the case. Jim was brilliant in knowing that we needed the tools. He had no idea how to use them, but he knew we needed them and he knew why they were important, and he was significant enough to position to get the funding. So by the time I came to Cal Poly, literally our first laser cutter was in a crate for 9 months because it took that long to get the installation system set up. But that was good. That gave me time. And we just had gotten the CNC router. So in fact, we had the CNC router running before we had the laser. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Which is just to say, I didn't mean to be psychic, but my timing was perfect. I went away. I knew this would be important, but I had no idea. I'd never seen a CNC router before. I went to do my PhD. Came back and I knew what I was doing. And I kind of not only how to use it, but kind of how I wanted to integrate it into curriculum. And in a way, the rest is history. I mean, the first 5, 6, 7 years, 5, 6 years, really was so focused on the digital physical integration, on how that impacted my PhD research. It was so night and day from when I started at Cal Poly. And I remember I was a practitioner, right? So I came into university teaching as a practitioner with a practitioner's mindset, which is I'm going to teach design and I'm going to teach this is how we design. This is, you know, practice. And I did it really well. And I'd love to talk more about that if you wanted to, but I had no research agenda. I had no concept that an academic had a research agenda, right? And so I still remember the first day of being introduced. And I was hired by a different department head. And then it turns out Margot was department head the day I arrived. And so she introduces me and says, and so Mark, what was your research agenda to the faculty? And I went, huh? And I'm like, and I just said, you know, the thing that was there is like, well, digital integration. Because that's what they wanted me for a Pullman. And I was like, I guess that's a thing.
Wow.
Yeah, then going away, maturing, having the sort of position and disposition to understand a research agenda, a long-term research agenda through the PhD, I was ready to go. So really night and day.
And you've literally spent, since the PhD or since coming back to Cal Poly, what is it now, almost 10 years or 8 years?
So I came back in winter of, I forget if it was 2007 or 2008.
8 maybe.
I think it was 2008. And again, I should say, like, you want to talk about risk. Like, if you want to go into this, you go into it because you know you have to. Like, this is your choice. It's really important to say, like we all romanticize, it's like a cultural thing to romanticize about the professor life. When I left practice in Chicago, my dear colleagues were pissed at me. They kind of said, Mark, when you said you wanted to teach, we just assumed you teach as an adjunct at University of Illinois, Chicago. We never never expected that you were going to just leave and be a full-time academic living the lightweight life. And then you do it and you're just like, whoa.
So explain that though. Explain that. Why is there that difference? Because I hear that all the time too.
Yeah.
What is that separation? Is it just because now you're in the university and you're in a position of research rather than, and I hate to say it this way because Cal Poly doesn't believe this, but it's research versus doing?
Right. Well, first of all, I think most practitioners don't think about teaching as research. I think this is my belief, and this is my belief kind of confirmed by kind of my mentors in Chicago, was there was such, in some ways, a disjunct between academia and the profession. Those that were very successful professionally had a bit of a distaste for academia.
Okay.
They went through, and in a way, it really built their foundation to be successful. But looking back, they're just like, I don't want to go through that again.
No.
And I know that to be the case. I can't generalize about that for everyone, but I certainly know from some of the people I worked with and was mentored by, that was the case for them. And so I do really think there's a huge disconnect between practice and education. And I could talk about the benefits of that, right? I think, your undergrad education is more than just becoming a professional architect. It's really about becoming a human being and making time and space for that. It's really important to say. It's also important that you really develop design ambition that's going to get you 20 years out, not just make you capable to get your first job, but it has to be able to get you your first job, right? And so, so there are a lot of complexities to that equation. But I just wanted to again emphasize like that romantic idea about becoming a professor. If you really want to do it, you have to do it. There were so many people that told me I shouldn't do it, and I'm just like, no, this is there's like a gut, like a personality, like I think I'm going to be good at this. Right. And I do think it goes back to the people part of, I think, really caring about students and kind of being vested in their futures as well. But when I came back to Cal Poly after, Oregon, I still was not tenure track. I still came at risk. I came at risk. One, there wasn't a position available. And that's the other thing you have to realize is like, it's not like the corporate world where you just get hired if they have the need. It's like, it's years out of planning for these positions, of getting the funding for the positions, and then a year of interviews and hires. And so I did know positions were going to be available. And again, I just want to emphasize, like, I was always comfortable taking the risk if the wager was on my own abilities, because I had control of that and felt like if I succeed, then I'm successful. If I don't succeed, then I just don't want to be there. And so it's really kind of an important lesson. And so anyway, I still remember the lecture I gave for my tenure track interview, and I remember killing it. I just remember, like, there are times you get to give a lecture and you're like, that did not go well. And you kind of, you get a read from the people you're connecting with. And I remember the energy in that room, and it was really fun. Yeah.
One last thing to cover before I got some other questions to think about, but your position now.
Yeah.
You have transitioned across the board and gone in a vertical path to associate dean, I would say.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Because I think it's important to understand you've gone from practice,
yeah,
to teaching, and now teaching, but also the dean.
What is that?
What is that? And I just want to clear that up because
yeah,
it's a very interesting position. And this class is about understanding the idea is about understanding what you can do with an architectural degree.
Yeah.
Where does that go?
Yeah.
What is your position now?
And it's amazing how one evolves, because when I first started teaching out of practice, somebody asked me, so Mark, you think you'd want to be department head one day? It was an odd question.
Yeah.
My response was not a gentle one. It was a definitely no, with maybe a few extra words. And what's interesting is, as you grow and kind of see what the opportunities and potential is, the way I see it now is, in practice, I was really focused on designing schools, physical schools. As I started to build schools, I became more interested in the people in them. As I started seeing students kind of use the schools that I designed. And as a professor, then I was really focused on the student in that school environment, albeit a university one. The more I did that, I became aware of the overall kind of academic apparatus. And that's a weird word, but maybe it's the right one, right? There's so much other else going on that shapes and affects the environment and how that school is developed, that was the opportunity I saw in administrative leadership at the associate dean level. And I think the really brilliant thing that Christine did too is having an associate dean that still taught a little bit. I never would have taken this position if teaching wasn't part of it. Now that I've done it, it's like, it's hard to juggle both. It's not impossible, but it's hard. But I have to say, it's really rough in that I don't teach studio, and in any architectural curriculum, studio is king. Yep. And I don't mind in teaching it. In one, a colleague described the practice as the suburbs of the curriculum. I actually don't think that's the case the way we have the 2-quarter studio. And I think it's for me, I have a lot of pride as one, because Tom and I really developed that and piloted it. And it's integrated into practice. But I know what students think about practice. I know that I had to drink a pot of coffee just to get through the practice that I went through. I totally get it. Yeah. It's no problem. I get it. But also then I think consequently students see me a little bit differently. And that's been the hardest thing, is being a voice of no. That's been really hard. And then also not having the studio where students really get to know you. And what's neat about our culture is students get to hear about their faculty from other students' lens. And so even though it's not always accurate, you get a sense about what different faculty are like. A student to me this year said, Mark, you used to teach studio? And I just, oh my God. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's all I've done. It's only recently that, I'm not. And I think you know this because I shared it with you, because you ended up getting the studio space that I had taught in. And when I walked out of that studio, like before that fall quarter, when I started as associate dean, because I've left a lot of stuff in there, sorry. I don't mean to be dramatic. I did cry a little. And I was just like, I was fighting. I was just like, nope, you just gotta stay focused. And so I do think that's it is an incredible thing the way we teach. And I should also say, we have to have people that continually can validate, can fight for that way of teaching, because it is expensive and it is not understood. And so when you're at a university that is always, why it's so expensive? Like, how can this be? We also need to really be able to articulate that it's why we do it this way, how it is and can be really good teaching. Yeah. And I think most of you don't like it because you're jealous, which is really the truth. You just can't say that. Everybody wants to teach this way, right? You connect directly with your students. You get time with them. It's a lot of time, which does affect a lot of other things, but it's a wonderful way to teach. And I think it's a challenging way to learn, but I do think you really learn in a different way. And that's why I think architects, and this is perfect. This is why I think architects are educated in a way that alternate careers have incredible potential. even though you're learning maybe some technical education, you're learning about design, I think fundamentally you're learning about conception and execution. You are not doing the execution yourself. You're able to make plans for that, and you're able to articulate and position a design proposition and why it matters. That could be company branding, that could be web design, that could be a nonprofit. And even though it's not a building, it's that ability and that mindset that is just so unique that there are so many pathways I think that architects could do. And so let me jump again and look at your questions. It's also why I think students should get licensed. And you might think about the license as, I'm getting the license just to sign documents. If all the license is about signing documents, the firm of 180 people I work for, 100 architects, you only need one person.
Yeah.
If you really want to have that mindset. But I really would love to see architects out in the world using their skills and their abilities to connect people, ideas for change, for the good. Have that acknowledgement that that this is really what an architect is.
Right.
Don't look up architect in the Webster's dictionary, which says something about one who draws floor plans. I mean, it's kind of what it is if you look up architect in the dictionary.
Right.
And so I really think that's really important. And I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox here as well, because I think we need to better define architect, not with a different title. Like we talk about the architect as artist, and somehow the architect as artist is, for me, it's a shorthand for actually describing what an architect is and does in the best and highest sense. And as soon as we substitute architect for something else, I actually think we've done a disservice to actually really describing what a significant architect is. And that could be Tom Main, that could be Frank Gehry, that could be Zaha. Sure, yes. But that could also be somebody that is running a nonprofit and says like, well, how do you do this? You're like, well, I'm an architect. And architects, the way we think and conceive is not just about buildings, it's about people. It's about kind of looking down the road and seeing what needs to be done years before it gets done, and making plans for that. Those plans could be technical drawings. Those plans could be organizational diagrams. Those plans could be, you know, if we wrote better as architects, that's a whole other hour. But, you know, it could be making, you know, real kind of strategic kind of business plans. So, yeah. All right, I'll step down. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. All sound bites that I'm going to I think that it brings up a really good point of, you know, what are the qualities that you need to really make change in the world. And, you know, this being somebody that graduates from an architecture school with an architectural, you know, B-Arch or an M-Arch, or, you know, even on the path to becoming an architect, it's important to finish that path, to finish it through by becoming a licensed architect, so that you can have all the knowledge. And I do say that, like in Cal Poly and everything that they talk about, students always ask, why don't we learn more about the business, or why don't we learn more about the office? It's because your education is not, it does not stop when you get your B-Arch. Your education should continue throughout your whole career. And there is a plateau, there's a step that you have to take to fully understand everything, and that's called licensure. Yeah. And so that's when you get the rest of your education that everybody complains that they're not getting in undergrad or even M-Arch, is like that office component, which is huge. It's a huge component. When it comes down to becoming a professor as this alternative career, you got your license, you say like, that's number one quality. What other qualities or traits do you have to have, in your opinion, to be a professor of architecture, or to be just professor with an architectural background?
Well, I mean, you have to be self-driven, right? So when you're a professor, it's kind of interesting. You're like an independent consultant, really. Even though you're working for a university, you don't have to deal with billing and all of this stuff. And it's probably like, if I had my own practice, I would go broke, because I would have so much fun doing the work. I would never bill anybody. And this is a true story with a project that I've just completed. It's just like, nah, I'll just do it for free.
Oh my gosh.
Stupid. That tied into my research. There's good reason for it, Andrew. But anyway, but it is like you're an independent consultant. So you really, nobody, not completely nobody, but really you need to direct your career path. You need to be disciplined enough to position yourself where you want to go. And that's not just a job requirement. That is the job as a tenure track faculty. Now, if you're and I think it's good students don't make those distinctions between lecturer, part-time lecturer, and tenure track faculty and tenured faculty. I don't think they do, because they're all faculty to them. But they are very different paths with very different expectations. And so in terms of tenure track faculty, it is very important that you are thinking about your teaching, but you're also thinking about your, I really don't like the word research for our profession, because it could be creative practice. But it is that what you're doing is advancing the profession in some ways. That kind of continues, I was talking about that with the PhD. And so fundamentally, that's what research is, right? So research is not just about you. It might be driven by your interest and your expertise, and absolutely what you value, no question about it. But what you're trying to do is articulate that in a way that other people can understand it and benefit from it, that advances the profession. Or I talk about profession because we're a professional degree program, but it could also be, if I'm a biologist, it advances the science.
Interesting.
So, and there are many different ways and nuances of doing that, right? And so, and creative practice is one of them.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So just being driven, and that the continual desire to learn it's all about that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not about learning as studying, it's about learning as living. And I think that is the beautiful part of the life. I mean, I think is, if you want to be absorbed in something, maybe even to a fault, I could go on. Our honeymoon was about seeing work by Lou Kahn on the East Coast. Our family vacations are going wonderful places, but Dad's got to see this museum, and so it's everywhere. It's like, I don't go anywhere where I don't look up first and say, hey, what's going on the ground there? What are some significant projects? And, if I'm in Phoenix for a little bit, what's the latest thing that was built there? Let's go check it out. So, yeah. You're laughing.
No, I mean, it's a good point. Our work is never done. It's always in our head. And it's the hardest thing for my wife to understand.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. I can't turn off a switch or punch a clock. It doesn't work.
No. And you know what? I think that's a pretty privileged position, right? To be able to have that as a way of life. I do think it's not easy. It's wonderful. It sounds so romantic, and it's wonderful, and it is hard, but it is privileged that to be able to have that position in life where everything you're trying to do and advance is really about what you have belief in. You think it makes a difference to other people's life, which I think is really, is an important distinction. Yeah.
One last thought, and you can have as much time as you want after this, but I think that I would like to hear what your biggest recommendation would be for somebody that wants to become a professor.
Thank you. And we didn't get to that. And the first thing is, when you get out of school and you start practicing, stay engaged with schools of architecture that are around you. It can be a little bit hard, by the way. And if you think about your faculty aren't going to invite some random unknown person into your studio reviews, right? So it really start to get to know people. The way you present yourself and talk about your interests will have a big impact on your ability to get invited for reviews. When you get invited to reviews, be yourself. Do not try to act like you think you're supposed to do. Do not try to be somebody else other than you are, please. And I say that because you can act the part and maybe somebody's like, oh, wow, this person's really good. It won't be you and you'll burn out, and just be you. If it really works, if you are making really good comments, if you are connecting well to the students, you'll get invited back. And so I think that would be the most important thing. I had a really interesting opportunity in Chicago to teach in an experimental kind of space called Architecture in the Humanities. I'm missing something in that title. It was short-lived, about 2 to 3 years. It was a little rented loft space by faculty. And for me, it started by taking classes there. So I just took a few classes in the evening. They were all, theory-based, really wonderful. And it was about architecture in the humanities, and taking a few classes there, and there were, 4 or 5 people and a couple of faculty. And it was really much more like a discussion seminar, and then you're giving back. And the more you add value to that over time, then said, Mark, I'd like you to teach a class with me. Whoa, really? And it's a great opportunity, right? And so, and that's how you get into teaching. It's not like it's a switch. Although as much as I presented it as a switch, like going from, my daughter's born and going to Cal Poly. No, there really is a transition. And so get to know people. If you are in San Francisco or LA and you don't know anybody, talk to your faculty at Cal Poly. Come up and pay us a visit. Get yourself back in. And then, as that starts to happen, it's like, hey, you know what? I think you'd be really great with this faculty at USC. Why don't you go and I'll introduce you. And that's kind of how, so, I would really encourage, stay connected to academia. And that would be it. And keep reading. Yeah. Does anybody
digitally read? Or on, but do they read books anymore?
I don't know. I was thinking about that this morning.
Any last thoughts? I mean, this has been great. I think that kind of unveiling the process you went through is invaluable because of the ideas that you have presented, the idea that you have evolved from a person that wanted to practice as an architect all the way into changing the landscape of education.
Yeah.
I know that you dabble on the side still, but like really leaving practice, leaving practice behind.
It's really important, and I really appreciate that leaving practice behind as the position of a practitioner, and because I want to push back on that. And in my mind, I haven't left practice. And I think that's really important to say, is that I didn't leave practice as we know it in Chicago because I didn't like it. I loved it. And I still, there's a little bit of a hard to leave that behind. But I also think, that the thought I had in Chicago was, my God, I just spent 18 months of my life on this one building. If I'm going to impact change in our profession, in the environment, I've only got, and I kind of did the math. I'm like, I've only have like 5 or 6 buildings in me. That's not really how it happens as you advance, but that's my mindset there then. And I just kind of thought, no, I'd really like to affect change by, if I can be a seed of change in the profession via education, now you're like, wow, there's so many other students out there. And so that was kind of my thinking when I started. But again, I think in my mind, I think it's so important to emphasize, like, and this is for me, this may not be the case for everyone. I love my practice. I love that experience I had. I found I love teaching more. And that's why I continue to teach. I am a fundamental believer in this continuum of education to practice, whatever your practice might be. And it really is about making change in the world. It's not just being a kind of commodity product that we all love to bash on. And for me, it's also really, it's not just the Garys and the Zahas. It's like, it's that little project by an architect you've never heard of that you stumble across and it just makes you smile, right? Yeah. It's like, that's, and you know, being an architect, that little thing was hard fought. I'd actually rather see more of those than just trying to educate the next Frank Gehry. And so that really is, from my point of view, the Garys of the world can become the Garys of the world because they are so driven to be that. And whatever new variety of Gehry and Zaha is going to be. And I applaud them, and I think it's phenomenal. I'm really not, I sincerely mean that. But I just mean they're going to do it. It's, I think, that middle and elevating the middle so that everyday kind of thing you stumble upon that may not make Arc Daily. Well, Arc Daily publishes anything now, so it probably could if we put it to them. But you know, that's because that's about people, right? And it's about, like, it's not just architecture as a tourist sport, you know, where you travel to kind of see significant architecture. It's the architecture of the everyday that elevates your everyday experience. I'd love to help contribute to that, and I'd love to help, you know, a group of phenomenal young architecture students help develop that ambition.
That's great.
That's why I do what I do.
Well, Mark, I won't take any more of your time. I really appreciate this. This has been awesome. So thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I mean, it's talking about, you know, we still need practitioners teaching at Cal Poly. It's really important to make that connection. And that, again, talking about, you know, creating that environment, we have to have that in the environment. So I love this class and what you're doing. And I really hope the students have enjoyed it and are getting a lot out of it. And they may not even realize what they're going to get out of it until 10 years from now when they're sitting at a desk in an office and realizing, I'm gonna act on what I really want to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The alternative. Find the alternative being that you want to be and take what you've learned with you.
Yeah. Well done.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. Enjoy.
Yeah, take care, man.
All right.
Bye.